Now, the question that comes to mind right about here in our study of church history is, what next? The fact of the matter is that the Protestant Reformation that broke out in the early part of the 16th century created a plethora of historical realities that occurred just after that. Europe, in many ways, was tipped over on its head by virtue of what took place in the Reformation. And so there's so many things we could talk about. The problem is that many of them are boring, and they're not really all that relevant to us today. They're relevant in the sense that every one of them feeds into where we are today. But fundamentally, there's a whole lot of stuff that we could spend a bunch of time on, but it's really, those discussions are really more for a world history class than they are for a church history class. I mean, we could talk about the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, for example. And that's had an effect upon the church because it was, in fact, a religious war between the Protestants and the Catholics. But it's, it's interesting, but if you're really interested, you can go and pursue that yourself. What I'm trying to do with this class is to help us to navigate through how we got to be here as Reformed Baptists in the 21st century. So the idea is to try to focus on the particular elements of church history beyond the Reformation that are particularly relevant to us. Okay, so I'm going to be a little picky and a little choosy here as we go forward, because I think that although there's so much more we could talk about, we kind of have to narrow it down a little bit. And the fact of the matter is I'd really like to bring this church history class in for a landing at some point in the not too distant future. So the goal would be to sort of hit the bigger issues after the Reformation up to the modern church. Because I think, frankly, there's a lot of stuff to talk about in the modern church as much as there is in the Reformation church that deserves our attention. Okay, so where we're going to go tonight is I want to talk very briefly about what I'm calling the post-Reformation church. And what I mean by the post-Reformation church is just that little window of time between the Reformation and the beginning of modernity. Just a little window in between. Remember, the period of the Reformation itself really only lasts about 100 years. I mean, you could talk about the actual Reformation with a capital R really only taking about 50 years, that first 50 years of the 16th century. So this little window isn't very big either. It really only encompasses most of the 17th century, and maybe not even the entirety of the 17th century. So the 1600s is this particular period. We'll talk a little bit into the 18th century, but not too terribly much. So as we move out of the Reformation, you remember that the Reformation began early on with some early reformers like Wycliffe and Huss. That started some early Reformation thinking. Then you got the main Reformation with Luther and Zwingli and others, the contemporaries to those men at the very heart of it. And then later, as you move further along in the Reformation church, you've got the later reformers like Calvin and Knox and so forth. Okay, so you have this flow through roughly the 16th century. You have the early part of it in the 16th century. You have the very later part of the Puritans in the late 17th century. And then in the middle, you have various responses to the Reformation by the church. You've got the Catholic Counter-Reformation in there. You've got the Puritan response in the late 17th century with the Westminster Confession and so forth. And then you've got the Arminian response, which we looked at last week, which came in the early part of the 17th century. So we're going to be looking at the Protestant branch of Christianity in the West being established in the 16th and 17th century to now the complete separation between it and Catholicism. Okay, so we're going to split the Protestant church from the Catholic church. All right. The original intention of Luther and all of those like him was to reform the church. That never happened. And so we wind up with two branches in the West. So we're going to, as I said, we're going to carry ourselves down the stream of Protestantism here. You remember I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The Council of Trent, the Catholic Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, sealed the Catholic Church, cemented the Catholic Church into what it is today. Okay? It was in the 16th century what it is today. There have been a few minor changes along the way about the Catholic Church, particularly in the 20th century when you get to Vatican I and Vatican II. But fundamentally, the Catholic Church is today what it was then. There's really very little difference. So we'll hit a couple of highlights of the Catholic Church along the way, but we're basically going to leave them behind. Just as we left the Eastern Church in 1054 at the Great Schism and moved to the West and talked about the Western side, we're going to do the same thing here. We're now going to leave one branch of Christianity behind, which is the Catholic Church. Not really sure I believe what I just said, one branch of Christianity, but nonetheless, a particular element of the history of the so-called Christian church in Europe. We're going to leave that behind and move along the branch of Protestantism. So we're going to move, as I said, into what I call the post-Reformation church, the movement of Christianity within the stream of Protestant thinking that will lead us out of Europe into the 13 American colonies, but more importantly, will lead us out of the medieval period into modernity, from the medieval age into the modern age. So there is a little transition in there that I want to talk about tonight. There's a bit of a discussion, the church, quote unquote, that straddles the Reformation of the 16th and 17th century on one side, and what will arise in the modern age. And I'm dating the modern age to about the middle part of the 1800s. It's really when the modernity begins. Some suggest that modernity really begins in the middle part of the 18th century, but I'm going to push modernity a little further ahead to the 19th century because I think that's where it's going to be, and it's going to continue into the 20th century. So tonight, I want to talk to you about an extraordinarily complex subject. And I can guarantee you that by the end of our time tonight, you will either have dozed off or run screaming from the room. One of the two is going to happen. But we have to have this discussion because what we're going to be talking about tonight, I hope you will notice by the end of our time, is so much a part of the church today. Okay, and you'll see why as we go. And I want to talk to you tonight about the age of reason. The age of reason. What I mean by the age of reason, the reason I've entitled it the age of reason is because there's 4 books in the Canon Press series on church history, and their 4th volume is entitled The Age of Reason. It's really sort of the entire 4th volume that involves the church coming out of the Reformation and going into modernity. It begins with a period of time known as the Age of Reason, but you could make an argument that the entire period is the Age of Reason. Now, there's a couple of other ways that couple of other titles that can be used to describe this. Some have called it the Age of Rationalism. Some have called it that. But probably the term that you're most familiar with, but probably don't know what it means, is the Enlightenment. Okay? So let's talk about the Enlightenment, which is just synonymous with the term Age of Reason or Age of Enlightenment or Age of Rationality. They're all the same thing from a historical perspective. This period is an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the West during the 17th and 18th centuries. So the 1600s through the 1700s is dominated by this age called the Age of Reason. It is a period of time focused on the pursuit of knowledge by reason and the evidence of the senses. Reason and the evidence of the senses. It's a time in which matters of intellectual understanding came to be pursued through the lens of rational thought. We call it rationalism. That's the name, Age of Rationalism. Period of time in which intellectual understanding came to be pursued through the lens of rational thought, the use of reason to discern truth. The use of reason to discern truth. Now, this period is a continuation of a period that began 200 to 300 years prior to this. You remember that sometime back we talked about the rise of humanism, and we talked about the rise of the scientific method that even began early on with men like Galileo. Remember, Galileo was a scientist that lived in the 14th century, and he pictured the universe as a model of mathematical study, and there was a movement in humanism to bring about this scientific discovery approach, mathematics, astronomy, biology, chemistry, all the big sciences were explored and brought to bear during this period of time. This was much earlier than the Age of Reason. In fact, this was even before the Reformation. You can make a very good argument that the reason why the Reformation was successful in breaking out as it does, because many of the realities of this scientific method, this scientific world, found their way into Europe, and the ability for men to create things through science helped promote the Reformation itself. For example, the development of the movable type printing press was an instrument in the use of expanding the Reformation throughout Europe. Cheaply printing books and distributing them became a hallmark of the Reformation. So it had already begun, but this adds something to it. Now take the scientific approach and create an approach to truth through the scientific method and through something called reductionism. That sounds like a difficult word, but it's actually very simple. It's the idea of understanding something through its simpler parts. In other words, reduce it to its simpler parts. You pop open the hood of your car, what do you see? You see an engine. But that engine is made up of parts, many parts. Each individual part having its own purpose, etc. But the entirety of all those parts working together creates an engine. The engine itself really doesn't exist. It's just a bunch of individual parts all working together to create the function of an engine. That's reductionism. So it's the idea of taking complex concepts down to their lesser complex realities through the scientific method. So an approach to truth that uses this methodology. And it's also an increasing questioning of religious orthodoxy. In other words, whether things can be true apart from the existence and actions of God. Is it possible, for example, for us to discern truth in the world without appealing to religious orthodoxy, the very existence and actions of God himself? So this is the age of reason. It is taking humanism, which is a focus on human beings at the core, and pushing it to its logical extreme in the sense of establishing a philosophical system by which a man assesses himself simply by virtue of his own senses. Okay? You with me so far? I lost anybody? I don't see anybody sleeping yet. But Clint's over here wondering if he went to McDonald's twice today. He's all right. So, this is the scientific method, but it has an interesting twist. It's called the Enlightenment, not because men suddenly became enlightened to the physical world around them. That had already occurred. That had occurred 100 years before. More than 100 years before. No, it's called the Enlightenment because it has to do with an effort to advance the understanding of the human person. Not just an examination of flora and fauna, but an examination of us. Who are we as human beings? And also, by extension, who is God? Through the power of reason, through the power of intellect. That the idea, or philosophy that says that we can understand ourselves, along with the world around us, through the power of intellectual observation. That reason can also reveal much about the human person, just as it had opened doors to the fuller understanding of the world around us. So in other words, this is an age not of enlightenment scientifically about the world, the structure of chemical bonds and physical realities, but rather an enlightenment about who we are. Now, to me, the term is oxymoronic because it really isn't an enlightenment at all. It's actually, for many ways, a step back. Religiously speaking, Christianly speaking, from a Christian worldview, the Enlightenment is actually a step back, as you will see. But it's been dubbed the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. All right. So, the Enlightenment then is an enhanced view of ourselves in relation to the world in which we live. That the scientific method could help to explain even matters of our own existence without, necessarily as a consequence, the need for religion. The ability to understand ourselves through rational thought and the scientific method without the need for orthodox religion. Now, you probably are already beginning to think in your mind, yeah, that kind of sounds familiar. Kind of sounds like the modern day in many ways, right? All right, I'm going to get you there. Just hold the thought. The Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment, will have dramatic effects on the church. It will have dramatic effects on politics. It will have dramatic effects on culture and a whole many more things, and will be a strong component of the makeup of the modern church in the Protestant stream. In other words, the reason why I want to focus on this subject tonight is because the modern church, as we know it today, has been deeply influenced by this Enlightenment. The advancement of the scientific method into the world of the humanities would have strong repercussions within the church moving into the modern era. So you'll notice why I'm putting this here. There's a bridge between the Reformation in the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern period. What moves Europe from being a medieval world to being a modern world? And the answer is this. This rationality, this philosophical thinking about ourselves becomes the bridge between those two things and creates modernity. Along with, of course, technological advancements. We'll get to that later. But this is one of the strongest effects, or one of the strongest things that affect the modern age. All right, so let's talk about some of the proponents of this, and we must begin with, okay, where did this start? All right, who's to blame for this particular movement? And the answer is a man by the name of René Descartes. You're probably familiar with that name because there is a very familiar sentence attributed to him. Descartes' philosophical system was based on great confidence in mathematical reasoning. Okay? He's a very sharp guy, and he believed that mathematics were, and are, as anyone who's familiar with math, is very specific, rigid, defined, structured. Truth is truth, falsity is falsity within the world of mathematics. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It does not equal 5. It does not equal 3. Okay, yeah, I know. In a post-truth world like we live in, it can mean anything you want it to mean. But in the strictest sense, in mathematical terms, reality is reality. Descartes based a great deal of his thinking upon geometry. The simple reality that in the geometric sciences, there are factuals, and that's it. Okay? But he also embraced, quite along with it, the idea of a great distrust in all that is not certain. Meaning that in a geometric sense, there are certain things that are absolutely true. But there are also things that are seriously doubted by virtue of the fact that they're not part of that truth. In other words, I could say with certainty that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but I have serious doubt that 2 plus 2 equals 5. Okay? So in other words, from a purely rational perspective, there's the reality of both that which is solid and trustful and that which is not. Okay, so Descartes started his world in this way, this dichotomy of that which can be factual, that which cannot be trusted. He believed that he should start then with an attitude of universal doubt. I don't believe anything until it can be proven. I'm going to believe a single thing until it can be proven. To doubt the existence of everything until he could prove its existence. Now, of course, the natural question is, okay, where do you start? If you doubt everything, where do you start? Well, this is where Descartes becomes famous. He starts with himself. I think, therefore, I am. All right, that's the famous statement associated with the man. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What Descartes did was he found the first undeniable proof of something in himself. I exist because I'm a thinker. Now, I would utterly agree with René. I think he's right. In fact, I've even challenged people in the past to do this little experiment. Try to imagine you don't exist. Okay? Go home, find a dark room, lay there, close your eyes, and imagine you don't exist. You can't. You will always come back to, well, yeah, I'm still thinking, aren't I? Okay. Bottom line is, he recognized himself. He knew that he existed. This was only proof of his existence in terms of his mental abilities, but he couldn't prove that he had a body. He couldn't prove he had substance outside of himself. He said, I think, yes, but in terms of everything else, I have to doubt. In other words, he believed that his senses could be fooled into thinking that things actually exist outside of himself. Ever had a dream that you've woken up that seemed so real, and yet it was utterly fictitious and occurred only in your mind? Your senses can fool you, can't they? So Descartes started from the perspective of, I doubt everything except that which I can prove. The only thing I can really prove is the fact that I exist by virtue of the fact that I can think. I can't imagine anything else but my ability to think. So then Descartes applied this reasoning to the existence of God. He borrowed an older apologetic. Descartes was able to say, or his philosophy of the existence of God, his apologetic for the existence of God worked like this. Can you imagine a being greater than you? Yep. I can imagine a being greater than me. Can you imagine a being greater than that one? Mm-hmm. Can I imagine a being greater than that one? Mm-hmm. And just keep doing that into infinity. Because you can always imagine something greater. Something more powerful, something more omniscient, something more omnipresent, right? And what do you eventually get to? Well, you eventually have to get to the idea that there must be an ultimate being that possesses infinite knowledge, infinite position and presence, etc., because you can imagine it. Okay, so Descartes' idea of his apologetic was to say that he could conceive of a being greater than himself, and that led to the existence of an even greater being. It was from this reasoning, the existence of God, that he was free then to move on to prove the existence of the world and his own existence in that world. So he started with, I think, therefore I am, but since I think, I can imagine, I can think of a creature greater than me, so therefore there must be a being greater than me. And so then he was able to say, okay, now let's work backwards from that being back towards me. Descartes' philosophical system had affirmed the idea of human beings, therefore, consisting of two parts: the mortal and the immortal. We talk about this a great deal in Reformed circles. We talk about the idea of human beings being bipart creatures, soul and body. The soul is that part of us which has that immortality, that sense of immortality. We would argue that the soul contains the essence of the man extending out into the image of God. Descartes said, yeah, that's exactly right. The body is a separate thing, a different thing from that. We recognize that. Even in Reformed circles, we recognize the distinction between the soul and the body, because at death we recognize that the body goes back to the dust of the ground, but the soul continues on and goes back to the presence of God. So we recognize this dichotomy already. And so Descartes had already seen this. But the issue for Descartes was, okay, how do the two of them communicate with each other? How does the soul work with the body? How does the body work with the soul? And at this point, I could insert about a half an hour of theories that were put forth to explain Descartes' position by a whole bunch of different people that came up with them. None of them were ever found to be truly satisfactory, how they communicate together. The only real satisfactory answer is that because we exist as bipart creatures, God must have in some way connected the two of them together in such a way that the two are able to work together. Don't know how. All we just know is that it's true. Now, all of this, you might think that Descartes was just your basic atheist, but he wasn't. Descartes was actually a very religious man. He was, I think, potentially even a believer. And he believed that his philosophy was useful to theologians. In fact, it became known eventually as Cartesianism, because his Latin name was Cartesius. And so it was thought that this Cartesian way of thinking could be useful. But many perceived his universal doubt to be nothing more than skepticism. In other words, many people assume that Descartes is not a believer because of this doubt philosophy that he has about everything. And so everybody just sort of assumed, well, this Descartes guy doesn't believe in anything, so therefore he must be some sort of atheist. That's not really the case. He's simply making the argument that if we're going to accept things as true, we don't accept them simply because they're told to us by somebody. We accept them because there's a sense in which they can be derived, they can be understood from rational understanding. So he didn't reject revelation or Scripture. He just had a different view of how to handle it. As I said, many perceived his universal doubt as skepticism, and so in the face of this rejection, Descartes moved from France to Sweden, where he spent the rest of his life. He continued to write philosophical works and so forth until he died in 1650. So you will notice that Descartes, living in the first half of the 17th century, is part of this late Reformation period, right? We move into the 17th century. This is before the Puritan response. So you have this sense in the very middle of the Reformation where you start to have these kind of men start thinking about these kinds of things, applying the scientific method and philosophical realities to the idea of the Christian faith. So, there were a number, however, that ran beyond him. All right? And I'm going to go quickly through this list because I am. We could write a whole book on each of these. Many have. One of the very first people to consider Locke's point of view, not Locke's, Descartes' point of view, was a man by the name of John Locke. You may be familiar with him because he has some effect upon the political realities of our day. He lived from 1632 to 1704, so he lived in the second half of the 17th century. He was an English philosopher of a school of thought called empiricism. Empiricism is that the world could not be deduced by simply looking inward, like Descartes did, but rather only through experience could one come to knowledge. What you experienced became what you knew, from Locke's perspective. Locke proposed that the only true knowledge that we have is that which is based on our three levels of experience. Ourselves, because we experience ourselves constantly, our experience of God, and then the experience of outer realities around us. Those are the three realities that any human being has. Himself, inward, the outward experiences and things that are around him in his world, and God. Those three things. We continually experience ourselves. Our senses are constantly bringing in information about the world around us. And God, then, is proven at each moment presently before us by virtue of the senses and the existence of the self. In other words, the fact that we live and exist and have experiences in the world demonstrates, from Locke's perspective, that there is a God. There must be. Okay? So Locke proposed that there was one more level of knowledge beyond these three. Beyond me and my experiences in the world and God. There was a fourth, and that is something called probability. Or what he referred to as judgment. Judgment, or probability in this case, is the ability to surmise what we have experienced repeatedly as true. Something we've experienced over and over and over again becomes true for us. Something that we cannot sense at the moment is probably still real since we've seen it before. Okay? I'll give you an example. Roger, pick one, is a married man, correct? How do you know that? And you've seen that wife again and again and again, have you not? Okay. She's not in the room now. You're not experiencing her at the moment, right? Locke's perspective goes like this. You experience certain things as true because they're repeated over and over and over again in your existence. They become true for you by virtue of their repetition. You may not be experiencing it at the moment, but it's still true. Your senses aren't sensing that thing that you believe is true because it's not in your reality at the moment, but it still is true even though your senses. He called that probability. The probability is that there is a God because you've experienced him over and over and over again, even though you may not be able to see him at the moment. It's the same idea. Thus, Locke assumed that knowledge derived from revelation and its attendant faith is highly probable but never certain. Okay? The best example would be this. How many of you saw the resurrection of Jesus? How many of you watched Jesus walk out of that tomb with your own eyes, thus your senses experience that experience? Anyone? I mean, Les is close in age, but not quite there. Sorry, Les. Sorry, I apologize. Right? None of us were there. Yet we all believe it's true. Okay? In other words, we're making a probability. We're assuming something on the basis of a probability because we have a revelation that has come to us that's told us it's true. We have witnesses that have spoken to us of it. We have centuries of people who have testified to it both through their own faith and through their own testimonies, their changed lives, etc. The result of that then is that we can look at that and say there's a high probability that Jesus walked out of that tomb on a Sunday morning. We can't prove it scientifically, nor should we have to, because it's been revealed to us, but it's a high probability. In other words, Locke's perspective was that Christianity was, from his perspective, the most reasonable of religions. In other words, he would reject the Muslim religion because it just wasn't consistent enough as compared to the Christian religion, which was. He could make an argument that the probability was much higher that Jesus had in fact been raised from the dead than Muhammad had met some God named Allah and his angel. There was a much higher probability from Locke's perspective of Christianity. Now, again, before you dismiss Locke as a radical, recognize that that is, in many ways, the essence of much evidential apologetics used in the modern church today. Right? It is, because you can't prove these things scientifically, but you can make logical arguments for it. I remember reading very early in my Christian ministry, in my Christian life, not ministry, reading a book by Josh McDowell called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He had written the book because he wanted to disprove that the resurrection occurred. He gathered all the evidence, put it together, and at the end of the book he said, you know what? The probability is very high that Jesus actually rose from the dead. He wound up taking all this evidence and proving the existence of the resurrection. So it's just a book of evidence. But none of us can be transported to the actual proof of it. So Locke's perspective was to be thinking through the probabilities of our experiences, the repetition of our experiences, these sorts of things, in order to say it is reasonable that the Christian faith is a reality. Okay? Now, again, if you're a thinking person sitting there, you're probably thinking, yeah, it's interesting how much of this falls into the modern church today. All right? Keep the thought. Which leads us to a group of people called the deists. They were also known as the free thinkers, the English free thinkers. They were called free thinkers because they opposed the narrow limits of orthodoxy. One of the chief proponents of deism was a man by the name of Lord Herbert of Cherbury, who lived from 1583 to 1648. Okay, notice the dates. Late 16th, early 17th century. He argued that the deists and him argued that true religion must be universal. It must be natural to all humanity. It's not based on revelations or historical events, but based on the natural instincts of every human being. The deists argued that human beings possess 5 fundamental characteristics that are immutable. They believe the following things at the very core of their nature. They believe in the existence of a God or creator, the obligation to worship that God, because if he does exist, then he should be worshipped. The ethical requirements of such worship, meaning that if indeed there is a creator and we are to worship him, then we are also to obey him. The need for repentance, meaning that if in fact we do obey God, that means there are parts of our lives that are probably disobedient, that need to be changed. And fifthly, there will be, of course, reward and punishment. If there is a God who expects ethical behavior, then there will be reward for ethical behavior. There will be punishment for non-ethical behavior. Okay, so the deists basically argued that, or held to a view of God whereby our connection to him is only theoretical. Okay? He exists, yes, and we know he exists, and we know he's to be worshipped and obeyed, and we should change our lives and wait for the rewards and punishments. But it's only a theoretical existence. He exists outside of our framework of observation. We approach him simply by accepting that which we know to be true about God, without him interacting with his world. In other words, the deists believed that revelation was unnecessary. And in fact, there had really not been any significant revelation from God. That God had created the universe and then stepped back to watch it run. And left the functions of existence to us as human beings. Deism has never really gone away. There's always been deistic elements in Western culture. I remember vividly a song from the 1990s. In fact, it was released in 1990. It's a song by Bette Midler. Most of you probably don't even know who Bette Midler is, but Bette Midler released a song in the early 1990s called From a Distance. Anybody familiar with the song? Okay, so some of you are. Have you ever listened to the lyrics of that song? Closely? Okay. God is watching us from a distance. The song is deistic in its approach to us. The fundamental message of the song, go listen to the lyrics. The fundamental message of the lyrics is that we are responsible for the success or failure of our existence as human beings. God is watching us from a distance. He is observing us. He's not interested in us. He's not interested in actually being involved in the world. He is watching us do. And the appeal by Midler is, well, let's do what's right. If we do what is right, if we, stamp out hunger and all these sorts of things, then we can have a better world. God is watching us to see what we're doing. Now, you will notice that there's a great stream of deism in entertainment in America. I can think of at least two other examples of movies that portrayed God. There's a lot of movies that portray God. Morgan Freeman likes to portray God, apparently, and he did so in the movie with Jim Carrey. Oh, come on. Sorry, what was it? Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm deaf. Speak louder. Yes, Bruce Almighty. That's the movie. Morgan Freeman shows up, and what does he do? Well, it's all about you. You guys do your thing. I just stand back here and watch. That's the idea. That's a deistic approach. You get the same in the 1970s flick called Oh God. Remember that one? With John Denver and George Burns played God. And basically the idea was that God said, hey, it's up to you people. You do what's good and right. I'm just watching. Deism became a very real part of this philosophical movement. God is out there watching. It's up to us to ascertain him, but also to live our lives in this world and do what is good. We don't need a direct connection to God. We only need a theoretical connection to God. That was the deists. Which led to two other men, which I'm just going to go through very quickly because I want to get to my conclusion. One is a man by the name of David Hume. David Hume lived from 1711 to 1776. Okay, so you're talking 18th century. All right, so this is well after the Reformation. So we're closing in on the modern period at this time. Hume suggested that this empiricism, this ability to experience things and discover things by virtue of the senses, was simply what he called mental habits. It wasn't really real. It was simply a mental habit. The example that Gonzalez uses in the book is an excellent one. All of you could picture a billiard table, right? It's got balls on the billiard table, okay? Roger takes out a cue and he hits the cue ball and it strikes another ball. At that moment that it strikes the ball, you hear a sound and the other ball begins to move. The cue ball stops where it's at and the other ball begins to move. What you can't observe is the change between the actions of the cue ball and the actions of the ball that was hit. You just assume that the cue ball made the other ball move. But you can't prove it. You can't show it. You could scientifically with some sort of instrument. But that's the point. You are conditioned by virtue of your mental habits to simply assume that because one ball hit the other ball, that the force of the one ball hitting the other ball makes it move. But you really don't know that for sure. All you know is that this action took place, and you did not see the transfer between the two. It was instantaneous. You couldn't possibly have seen it. What Hume argues is that when we look out into the world, the things that we observe are not really what we observe. You call it an apple because it has the form of an apple, it has the color of an apple, it has the weight, and the shape, and all these other kinds of things. But how do you know it's an apple? And here's the question that I've asked for years, and I've never found a satisfactory answer because there isn't one. How do you know that when you taste something like a Kit Kat bar, it tastes the same as when I eat a Kit Kat bar? You can never know, can you? Because from your perspective, a Kit Kat bar tastes like a certain thing, right? It tastes in a way that's familiar to you. But I may not have that view of it at all. My taste buds may perceive it completely differently than you do. And yet, every time you see a Kit Kat bar, you eat it and taste it. You could be blindfolded and eat it, and you know it's a Kit Kat bar. I could do the same, even though we have completely different perspectives on it. Or let me put it like this. How do you know what blue is? Explain blue to me. What do you got to do with, What do you got to do with blind people who've never seen blue? Who are born blind, have never seen blue. What do you do? The best that you can do is give them something to connect the color to, but you can't explain the color itself to them. It is a perception that is unique to you and your senses, but really doesn't have anything in the real world that absolutely makes it the same for every single person, does it? So Hume's empiricism, he said that empiricism was simply nothing more than us substituting in what we think is actually there. Because that is our mental habit. Every time we see an apple, we say, oh look, an apple. Another man that followed along this line in the same category is a man by the name of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is often considered to be the greatest philosopher in the history of the world. He lived from 1724 to 1804. And he spoke of the illusion of the knowledge of those going before him. So he took all of these previous people, particularly Hume and others like him, and said, you people are all insane. He wrote a book called Critique of Pure Reason. And he argued that there's no such thing as innate ideas, only fundamental structures of our mind in which we place the data our senses provide. Very similar to what Hume had just said. Our minds order the chaotic mass of data that comes to us, which then become our experiences. But there's no purely objective knowledge outside of what we are able to grasp. Very much the same thing as what Hume was arguing. In other words, there's no way, Kant took this to his logical conclusion, there's no way to prove the existence of God or of the soul in a man. Our minds cannot grasp such things like eternity, infinity. We can't grasp the concept of infinity. We can't grasp the concept of a God that's infinite in mind. Just can't. Reason cannot know them because they are truly outside of us. Now, Kant didn't reject the existence of God, contrary to what many people say he did. He simply argued that there was a practical reason for God's existence having to do with moral life. Because Kant recognized that there was this strange thing in human beings called morality, which could not be explained by any other thing other than the existence of God. The argument, by the way, of the Imago Dei being also based on the concept of morality finds its essence in Kant. Okay? We are moral creatures. Why? If we are nothing more than evolved animals, then why do we act in moral ways and insist that other people act in moral ways? And the only answer you can come up with is that there's a God. That's Kant's reasoning. Okay? There must be a judge in the existence of reward and punishment, for that is practical in this world. Okay? So, as I said at the beginning, this is extraordinarily difficult stuff. You could read Kant and Hume and Locke for weeks and months and years and probably never really truly understand all of what they're trying to get across. And I'm just barely skimming the surface of this, and to be honest with you, a lot of it I don't even understand as I'm expressing it up here. But here's the thing. This period of time when these great philosophers stepped into the world of a post-Reformation church had some specific goals. There's one particular goal that stands out for the Age of Enlightenment, and it is to reform the Christian faith to its non-confrontational roots and to limit religious controversy from spilling over into politics and warfare. Because that's exactly what had happened in the latter part of the 16th century and into the 17th century. War. The 30 Years' War, for example. A religious war between Protestants and Catholics. Fighting over land. It became a political war eventually, but it began with this idea of who's right, who's wrong, and how do we discover where we're going to live and what we're going to believe and all these sorts of things, and it broke into war. And the men of the Enlightenment are saying, listen, we need to figure out a way to get back to the more fundamental realities of religion that doesn't get us to a place where we're constantly shooting at each other and killing each other. To curtail the political power of organized religion and prevent more intolerant religious wars. The key word there is intolerant. To develop a state in which the state would be tolerant of different positions related to belief and practice in Christianity. John Locke is particularly a key here. He was one of the first to develop the concept of a separation of church and state. A state that kept its nose out of religious matters and a church that kept its nose out of state-run matters in order that religion doesn't become the instrument by which war starts. And you will notice that the Americas were built on the idea of a separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson, for example, coming out of this time period, Thomas Jefferson was a student of this particular time period. He was a deist. He believed that God was out there at a distance watching us. And so it's been well reported, as you know, that Jefferson actually took out his Bible and tore out everything out of the New Testament that that spoke against this idea of God from a distance. He took out all the miracles of Jesus. He took out the resurrection. He took out every controversial subject like angels and so forth. Anything that couldn't be assumed rationally, logically, intellectually needed to be removed. Because those were, for him at least, the sources of the controversy. I mean, okay, we're going to go to war over the fact that you believe in angels and I don't. We can't prove the existence of them anyways. And so why are we fighting over these kinds of things? The idea that Jefferson had was we need to get back to a place where we have a religion, quote unquote, that isn't going to lead us into these wars of intolerance. Now, what are the effects then of this age of reason? Three primary things that flow out of this period of time. Number one, Protestant Christianity became massively sectarian out of this. Okay? Massively sectarian. Individual groups, thinking that they had proposed the right view of the faith, now separated themselves from others. You see that sectarianism in England in the latter half of the 17th century. The Presbyterians and the Congregationalists and the Baptists all went their separate ways. Right? Sectarianism was one. Second, Protestant Christianity became, unfortunately, highly intellectual. The concepts of revelation and reasonable objective faith were supplanted by views of doctrine developed along intellectual tracks rather than along experiential tracks. Now that can be good, but can also be a problem. Let me give you one example. I had the opportunity to preach on chapter 20 of the 1689 Confession at camp 2 years ago. And it's a series on a series from the chapter entitled Of the Gospel and the Extent of the Grace Thereof. It is not contained in the Westminster Confession, but it was added to the Savoy Declaration, which became a part of the Baptist Confession of Faith taken from it later. Sam Alderin writes this about the chapter. He says this, quote, "A general knowledge of the period permits the educated guess that the Puritan authors had already sensed the intellectual tendency which would later produce deism. With its emphasis on the sufficiency of human reason and natural revelation, and its opposition to supernatural revelation and the distinctive tenets of Christianity. Some men wanted to establish a completely rational basis for the existence of God and morality. They disliked the idea that a special revelation given only to some men was necessary to worship and serve God acceptably," unquote. In other words, that's his comments on this chapter 20 of the Confession. That the rise of reason and science would produce the tendency in men to think that they could figure out God for themselves without the need for special revelation. In other words, without the need of Scripture and the work of the Spirit to interpret it. That they could reason their way to an understanding of God through observation of the natural world and then define for themselves how any relationship with that God would be accomplished. So what the Savoy writers did, which the Baptists adopted, was to write 4 paragraphs in this chapter of the Confession to deal with that. In the first paragraph, they argue that the knowledge of God comes only through His grace to reveal Himself. God can only be known through revelation. In other words, they would fully agree with Hume that, God is pretty much outside of our ability to understand. But God has revealed Himself. Paragraph number 2, this revelation is only through the Word of God, not through nature. In other words, to pick up the argument from Romans 1, that yes, nature screams that there is a God, but it doesn't tell us who that God is or what that God is doing. We need special revelation for that. 3, the extent of this revelation is governed by the sovereign purpose of God Himself. God has not given this revelation to every man. He's given it only to those He has set aside to be His elect. That would be consistent with the rest of the confession, right? And then fourthly, the prerequisite of this revelation, or knowledge, is the supernatural work of the Spirit. The only reason that Colin here knows that there is a God through special revelation is because the Spirit of God has revealed it to him. He has not just thunk it up on his own. He's a smart guy. He's not that smart. That's the point of chapter 20. And it's addressing, in the confession, notice the dating, second half of the 17th century, as these men are rising to their philosophical positions, to argue that we can understand, we don't need revelation, we can understand God from just our really brilliant minds, and we can figure out our definition of God. And then, of course, guys like Jefferson trying to make sure that the vision of God that they have doesn't lead to interminable, intolerant wars. So we need to, scale down this vision of God, which causes less problems with people. The confession is specifically saying, we are not going to reason our way to God. God is not an intellectual exercise. Okay? But the third effect is that Protestant Christianity would become highly subjective. Because revelation from God as to His nature and work was subsumed into the thinking process of men, the message of Christianity could become whatever the individual dreamed it could be. Now, I just gave you 4 examples of men whose view of God was, in many cases, very different from one another. They had some commonalities, but really very weird, because they had literally dreamed up what God looked like. That the abandonment of God in any sense of rational science would eventually lead to a general atheism, resulting in the spiritual vacuum being filled with a version of religion based entirely on the subjective. Or we would call it in our day a personal God. My God. I mean, I've done away with revelation. I've done away with the idea that the church can tell me what God is. So now I'm standing there with my own vision of God, but because I cannot see God or ascertain Him through empiricism or scientific method, I really don't know anything about Him. So I have to make Him up in my own image. I have to picture God as I want to picture Him. In other words, I have to fill that hole in me that there is a Creator, that there is a God. I just don't have any way of knowing who He really is, so I'll just develop a version of God. You can make a very good argument that that's exactly what Muhammad and Joseph Smith did. Okay? They're men that very much follow this path. This, of course, becomes the basis of so much of the modern form of religion called I believe, ... People who start their theological conversations with the phrase, I believe, are telling you something. What they're telling you is, this is my understanding of God. It may or may not be consistent with Scripture, but it's what I believe. And it is, of course, the fundamental tenet of much of evangelicalism in our day. Okay, so now you see, the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, this new view of us in relationship to God, comes out of this period of time being affected by war, pestilence, famine, all these kinds of things that come as a result of the Protestant Reformation in Europe and the effect of it among sinful men. And so there's a rise of a new rationalism that's trying to produce some sort of stability in all of this. And the problem with it is it creates a whole new way of thinking about God where the idea of revelation disappears. I remember distinctly, I'll end with this, I remember distinctly at Bethel, 2003 to 2005, that my professors would not allow me to use the word inspiration in my papers. When I would write about a particular book of Scripture, I could not use that word. I could not say, well, God inspired this. I would have to make an argument from scientific method of why I believe Paul wrote this or did this or went here, did this. I couldn't say it was inspired. That is a direct result of this way of thinking. Okay, so it's going to have a deep impact as we move into modernity. In fact, in many ways, you could make a very good argument that modernity is nothing more than doubt everything, except only what can be proven to be true.